Hi, how you doing? In this video, we're going to try and answer a question that you probably weren't even asking. Way back in the mists of time, I made a video looking at what Walter Armstrong, the author of the All England book on wrestling, said back in around 1900 about Lancashire wrestling. The Lancashire style of wrestling is, without doubt, the roughest and most uncultivated of the three recognised English systems. So I thought it might be interesting to see if it was actually true. Was fighting in Lancashire actually rough and uncultivated? Or was it just dear old Walter being as prejudiced as usual? Before we get into the details, we need to set our parameters, give ourselves some context if you like. So the plan is to look through newspaper reports from the 1800s and see whether what they describe is indeed noticeably more rough and uncultivated in Lancashire than in the rest of the country. Obviously at this point I have to state that the actual work was done by my anonymous secret researcher. I just smiled and said, "Ooh, interesting," a lot, and then took all the credit. Also, it's probably fair to mention that this is just part of an ongoing project we've been looking at that will hopefully come out sooner or later, and that is only part of an even bigger project on their part. So, the reports. Without having any real guide to what rough and uncultivated meant, we decided that the simplest option was to look for records of something that was clearly against the rules everywhere else. Ground fighting didn't really seem rough and uncultivated enough, and while kicking a downed opponent would clearly count, kicking in itself was definitely part and parcel of wrestling in other parts of the country, so ran the risk of being reported simply due to geographical bias. So that was out too. We're going to look at kicking specifically in another video. In the end, we settled on biting for this video. We figured that would be a nice way to classify something as rough and uncultured, but not just a little bite, severe biting, biting off fingers, biting off ears, even noses. The reputation Armstrong was referring to was clearly not some recent fad, but seemed like a fairly well-established view. And in fairness, he's not the only person to express it. Samuel Bamford expressed a similar view in 1840. So we went back to 1800, and because we had to limit it somewhere, we took a sample range of 40 years. Coincidentally, within that 40-year period, there were 40 clear examples of reports of severe biting during some kind of physical altercation, and it was fairly easy to split them down into those that took part during an assault of some kind, where one of the people involved had not wanted to take part, and consensual fights where both people were willing. 25 of the 40 were during assaults, the remaining 15 during consensual fights, be that wrestling, boxing, or simply just fighting. We'll look at the assaults first. By far the biggest number of them took place in London, 16 to be precise. In second place was Yorkshire, with 2, with Lancashire, Cheshire, Worcester, Leicester, Bedfordshire, Edinburgh and Angus all having 1 each. So it's clear from this that biting in and of itself wasn't a Lancashire thing. And based on the size of Yorkshire compared to all the other counties, it's probably a safe assumption that the numbers simply represented population size. If you get enough people together in the same area, eventually they start biting each other. Fighting, on the other hand, was a little bit different. As we said earlier, there were 15 examples reported, and Lancashire did indeed top the list, but not by much. They had 4, with Cheshire and London both having 3 each. It's worth mentioning at this point that Cheshire isn't exactly a million miles from Lancashire, and part of what was then Cheshire is now Greater Manchester. Take from that what you will. Cumberland, Nottinghamshire, Hampshire, Berkshire and Glasgow had 1 each. It's worth mentioning that the case in Nottinghamshire was reported to have been carried out by a man from Lancashire, so depending on how strict you're being with your criteria, that could potentially count as another. So whilst this isn't the most rigorous of studies, and we probably shouldn't give the numbers an awful lot of weight, it's fair to say that they suggest that Lancashire did indeed have more of a tendency for more vicious forms of fighting than the rest of the country. Those of you who've been paying attention, and not just staring out of the window, will probably be fully aware of the elephant in the room right now.
I'm addressing the white elephant in the room.
And that's that at no point have we specified that we were looking at Lancashire wrestling, simply fighting. And that's because over the course of the 19th century in Lancashire, there was a transition from what was known as up and down fighting to Lancashire wrestling to catch as catch can. That was not a clear transition and didn't happen consistently, either geographically or chronologically. So for the purposes of this video, I've just ignored it. But for now at least, it does seem as if Armstrong, Bamford and the other writers at the time had at least some justification for their assertions that Lancashire men were known for rough and uncultivated fighting. I mean, I grew up in Yorkshire, so the idea of people from Lancashire being uncultivated fits perfectly for me. But what do you think? Is any of this a surprise to you? Stick something in the comments and let me know. And if what I've said here raises any questions for you, please let me know. It's a subject we're going to come back to in the not-too-distant future, hopefully. This is now my 30th daily upload, and if you're enjoying them, please consider supporting me so I'm able to keep going. You can sign up to channel membership here on YouTube. That gets you access to private instructional videos, both in pugilism and even one or two in catch wrestling. You can become a patron over at patreon.com/EnglishMartialArts, where I upload scans of old books and source materials, as well as documents and books I've written. Or you can just hit thanks under the video. If you can't do any of that, please just consider subscribing. And to those of you still here, at the very end of the video, fight team!